Continuing on with Unit 4, we're looking here at effects on our voting, effects on our ideology. And firstly, we're going to be looking at generational effects, 4.13. So there are some major event that happens in American history, and it changes how an entire generation starts to vote. And so usually a generation is about a 20-year group of people. That's give or take a few years. And if there's some big event that's happening, then they may end up changing how they vote. So let's look at that real quick. All right, so generational. By the way, just speaking of generations, how we vote does depend on age or how often we vote. So if you look at this chart right here, you could see that people in the purple who are 60 plus, easily the most likely people to turn out and vote. And you can see they approach 70% of elderly over 60 years old, I should say, people over 60 will vote in a presidential election. Notice that it dips up and down, and that's midterm elections, which are congressional elections, are always lower. Presidential elections, which get a lot more attention, are higher. And then 45 to 59, pretty high, pretty close. I mean, those people are engaged. And then notice how engagement in politics drops when you're younger, 30 to 44, and then 18 to 29. The reality is that 18 to 29-year-olds just don't vote much. But as they get older, they will. All right, so let's continue. So generation. There's some event that impacts an entire generation and changes political loyalty. An event that impacts an entire generation and changes party loyalty. All right, so what are some events that we could maybe throw out as that? Well, the biggest example and the most historic one that everybody, political scientists always use is the Great Depression of the 1930s. So the Great Depression, Republicans were in power when the stock market crashed, so they tended to get the blame for it. And then FDR gets elected in 1932, and he was pretty popular, so he kind of got credit. Of course, World War II happens, and he was commander-in-chief during World War II, so that kind of helps his legacy as well. But what happened is that a lot of people, especially in the North, that hadn't been very Democrat, had been more Republican, they start to vote in some pretty big numbers for Democrats. The Democrats had a lot of control of Congress from 1930 onward, 1932 onward as well. So that's an example. If you look at this 1936 election, this is the election when FDR won his re-election for the first time, and all the blue are states won by FDR. Overwhelming blowout. The only states that voted against him were Maine and Vermont. Maine, back in the 1800s, there was a old saying, proud to say, about my home state of Maine. And the old saying Maine was, as Maine goes, so goes the nation, because so many times whoever Maine voted for won the election. And then in 1936, people started making fun of Maine, and they said, as Maine goes, so goes Vermont, because Vermont was the only one not to vote for FDR along with Maine. So Maine lost its predictor value there. All right. So that's FDR, very popular. And this trend toward the Democrats lasted even after the Great Depression. Another event that's going to change things after this is the Cold War. And the emphasis goes from depression and economics and that sort of thing. Now, all of a sudden, security and fear of communism becomes an issue. So the Cold War from the 60s into the 80s favors Republicans. And of course, Reagan is kind of center at that. Gen X, which grew up during this Cold War during the 70s and 80s, tend and trend more Republican than other generations because they grew up during this era. Matter of fact, let's look at 1984, which was Reagan's re-election year. And you can see this map is almost the exact opposite, a very stark opposite of 1936, when every state was won but Maine and Vermont. Now every state went to the Republicans except two little blue spots, District of Columbia, you can see over there by Virginia, and then Minnesota, and that was it. And Minnesota almost went Republican as well. So Reagan he wins in the biggest landslide there's been. All right, cool. So that's 84. So that shows you how it trends that way. Generational effects. All right, political event effects. So now when we're looking at political events, just remember this. We're not changing the entire voting of a generation. What we're changing is the kind of trend in all of society toward a certain issue. So all of a sudden there's an issue, an event happens, and an issue starts to trend differently. Like everyone used to believe in this, and now in American society, we tend to not believe in this. So what are the political events that affect ideology across the country, not necessarily a generation? One, Vietnam. in the 60s, there became a trend in American politics in the 70s and 80s in particular for less U.S. world involvement. So just kind of like, you know what? Not real great about putting American troops in harm's way. Vietnam really took America from being involved in the world to being kind of a little more questionable about that. All right, so less U.S. involvement. And that, by the way, across both political parties. Watergate in 73, across both political parties, there becomes distrust in government. And you can look at polls about trusting the government, and it just drops throughout the 60s and 70s. No question, Vietnam also influenced that, but Watergate significantly influenced it. 9/11, September 11th, across the board, both Democrats and Republicans support more government power to secure us from terrorism. So we accept policies maybe at the airport or other aspects of our life, like the collection of data on our cell phones and on the internet, that maybe before we wouldn't have. Maybe like now we don't either, but back then we would because of security. And then the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was signed and pushed by a Democrat president, Lyndon Baines Johnson. Republicans in the House and Senate also voted fairly overwhelmingly for it. A higher percentage, actually, of Republicans voted for the Civil Rights Act than did Democrats at the time. But at the same time, Lyndon Baines Johnson, as a Democrat, really gets a lot of credit for this. So blacks who had already started trending Democrat since FDR begin to overwhelmingly vote Democrat after the Civil Rights Act. In fact, let's look at a chart for that. So look at 1936, 1940, 1944. You can see that black party identification was fairly equal. Of course, blacks historically were Republicans. I mean, from the Civil War onward, I mean, you had the Republicans who freed slaves, and Ulysses S. Grant fought for rights in the South against the KKK and whatnot. And then but then look at how it starts to trend. 48, 52 starts to go down. 56, Eisenhower still got a fairly significant amount of black vote. But then look at 64. After 64, it's down around the 75% identifies Democrat, and maybe 10 or 12% identifies Republican. So there's a pretty significant trend here as a result of black party identification. But it definitely started in World War II, Great Depression era. All right, that's political events. Now we're looking at life cycle events, 4.15 life cycle events. And these are events that happen in our lives, and we tend to trend one political party or another. So things that happen. If we get in political science, look at this. Not everybody, but political science, when they study this, they see trends. All right, first off, young people. Young people tend to be more liberal, so they vote more Democrat. Theories about that. Why is that? Well, they're less secure financially, so maybe they support government programs more. Another theory is they tend to be more idealistic and view the world in an idealistic sort of way, and so that tends to lead them to be more Democrat. They think the world can maybe change better, and if we just would do change would lead to better results. And then the flip is there's also some other events that affect how you vote. Here we go. There's the young vote. Sorry, I forgot I had this chart. There you can see, other than 84 and 88, although back in 76 as well, you can see Generation X here, the generation that was growing up in the 70s and 80s. They tend more Republican. But since then, from 92 onward, generally young people are voting more and more Democrat, and that is really accentuated in 2008 for President Obama. And so young people have trended more Democrat, especially in recent years, but not always, but recently, yes. All right, marriage and family. So growing up, getting into your 20s, getting married, having children, that tends to make people start voting more Republican. The question is this: whether people are actually switching parties, like people who were Democrats when they were young and identified as Democrats young, are actually switching to Republican, and certainly that probably happens some, or whether it's people who just didn't care about politics, and then finally when they get married and have family and start paying taxes and have to do all these adult things, if that makes them realize, what, I'm kind of conservative, and start voting Republican, because we know young people don't normally vote. So as they get older, they start voting more. And is it just their natural inclination toward being more conservative, which America tends to be more conservative than, say, European nations? But we don't really know. But that's just a theory. But we do know that marriage and family tend to make people vote more Republican. Certainly, married women vote way more Republican than single women. Like, it's overwhelming. Single women vote for Democrats, and it's a pretty significant majority of married women vote Republican. And then as people age, and as they're young, they're idealistic Democrats, and then they tend to be more Republican as they get into their 50s and 60s. And they tend to vote more Republican. One theory is taxes. They're paying more taxes, so they're worried about where that's going. Two, they just are not as idealistic as they were when they were young. So, they tend to maybe not see the world. They see the world in a different way, a more conservative way. And so they tend more Republican. So just because a young generation votes Democrat when they're young doesn't necessarily mean that when they're older, they necessarily will. So these, again, are life cycle events that tend to change how people vote. All right. So hopefully that helps you understand a little bit better about why we vote a certain way and just trends that we see across politics in terms of people voting based on age and events that happen. All right. Great. Thanks.